Hey photography beginners, I get it, you want to go the fast route, so this video will explain photography in 8 minutes. As everything in life, photography follows the 80-20 rule. With just 20% of the effort, you get 80% of the results. So let's make use of that to get you started quickly. It all starts with light, namely the light in your scene. That light is sent towards your camera and enters through the lens. Inside this lens is a mechanism that can block some of that light if it is too bright. This round opening, which can be made bigger or smaller, is called aperture. You can set it using your camera dials. The bigger number you set, the more light will be blocked. The smaller number you set, the less light will be blocked. Some lenses have wide openings and therefore allowed to set much smaller numbers, resulting in much more light entering the camera. These are much more expensive, but they're a huge advantage in low light. We'll get to that in a minute. After the remaining light passes through the aperture, you might think it immediately hits the light-sensitive device that records the image. That device is called sensor. However, the sensor is usually covered by a shutter. Only when you press the shutter button on your camera does the curtain lift to expose the sensor to the incoming light. After a set period of time, the shutter closes again and ends the actual image taking process. The longer the shutter is open, the more light the sensor captures and the brighter the image becomes. Usually, the shutter is open for just a fraction of a second, but on most cameras it can be extended up to 30 seconds, which allows the sensor to capture a lot more light. Very helpful in low light situations. Once the shutter closes, the sensor sends the data it collected to the camera's processor. That processor can optionally add gain to make the image even brighter. That gain is called ISO. The base ISO on most cameras is 100. If you set a higher number, the gain increases. That's again particularly helpful in low light. Unfortunately, it comes with a downside. Gain adds noise to your image. Depending on the camera, noise can become noticeable as early as ISO 400, while better cameras can handle higher values before the noise becomes distracting. However, in some cases you just have to live with noise. The best way to avoid using too much gain is to capture more light by adjusting aperture and shutter speed. But this is only possible within certain limits. If light levels are low, you need to compromise and accept a higher gain and with it, more noise. Noise removal software has become a lot better in recent years, so while it is best to avoid a high gain, you can improve noisy shots in software. More about image editing soon on this channel, so you may want to subscribe. But back to aperture and shutter speed. Apart from helping control image brightness, they both have an additional, more creative effect on your image. Let's start with aperture. When you choose a bigger number, the area from front to back that will appear sharp is bigger too. Photographers call that depth of field, even though depth of focus would be the much better term, as it determines how much of your image will be in focus. A large depth of field is often desired in macro photography, where you want as much of the subject sharp as possible, instead of say just the eye of an insect. In other situations, you don't want too much sharpness. For example, in portraits, you may want to separate your subject from the background. Choosing a smaller aperture number gives you a shallower depth of field and with it more blur on the background. This is why small aperture numbers are often used in outdoor portraits. Remember, not all lenses allow for low aperture numbers, so the ability to blur the background differs. A very popular beginner lens is the so-called Nifty 50, a 50mm f1.8 lens that is very affordable. On that lens you can set the aperture to 1.8 compared to around 5.6 that you can set when you fully zoom in on a typical kit lens. The difference is massive, as you see. I'll link some affordable Nifty 50 lenses in the description. So much for aperture. Let's next talk about the creative effects of shutter speed. Shutter speed can either freeze motion or blur it for creative effects. How fast it needs to be depends on your subject's movement. For a portrait, you can get away with around 1/125th of a second, while sports often requires 1/2000th of a second or even faster. Setting fast shutter speeds means the camera has less time to capture light. So in dark environments, picture a kid playing basketball in a gym, you will have to raise the gain to keep the image bright enough. The craft of photography is balancing these settings, achieving both the look you want, shallow depth of focus, freezing or blurring motion, and the correct image brightness. Decades ago, photographers developed the so-called exposure triangle that is supposed to show the balance between aperture, shutter speed and ISO. Unfortunately, the triangle leaves out the most important factor, the amount of light in your scene. This often misleads beginners into thinking photography is some magic mix. In reality, it is simply about responding to the light available. Your camera offers different ways to set aperture, shutter speed and ISO. These are called exposure modes. First, there is the full green auto mode. I recommend not using it as it is very limiting. Next is the P mode, which is a good starting point. Exposure is still automatic, but you can adjust other settings that we will discuss in a second. Then there are two semi-automatic modes. First, aperture priority, A or AV, in which you set aperture and the camera sets the rest. Second, shutter priority, S or TV for time value. You set the shutter speed and the camera sets the rest. And then there is manual exposure, where you set everything individually. That, however, is not part of the 80% that you'll need to actually start out, so I'll leave that out for now. Talking about manual operation, ISO can be set manually in most of these modes, but you can also set it to auto if you prefer. Okay, so much for image brightness, or exposure as we photographers call it. Equal important than exposure for a good shot is focus. What is an image worth if it isn't sharp? You can let the camera automatically focus on what it thinks might be a good idea. That could match with what you want it to focus on, but very often it doesn't. That's why it is smart to take control. You can't do this in the green auto mode, that's why I recommended at least switching to P mode. Then you can select which focus point the camera should use. Some cameras have more focus points than others, and some let you even choose their size. And another important focus setting is the focus mode. Before we continue, let me just drop a very important note. Don't expect that you will remember everything you learn in this video after watching it a single time. If you want to store the information in your long-term memory, you have to repeat it at least 2 times. So save the video and repeat it tomorrow. But back to focus mode. There are 2 different modes in almost every camera. One is better for subjects that stand still. So for example, a person in a portrait. It is called AFS. AF always stands for autofocus, and S in this case for single, because it will only focus one single time and then hold it. If you want to photograph moving subjects, for example sports or a running dog, that focus mode will not work because the camera focuses only once, and before you could press the shutter button, the subject will have very likely moved out of the plane you focused on and will appear blurred on your final image. Therefore, you have to change the focus mode to AFC, with C standing for continuous, so the camera will continuously try to focus on your subject. Some cameras, like Canon's, have a different name for these modes. Canon calls the AFC mode AI Servo AF and the AFS mode One Shot AF. For rare situations where autofocus fails, for example when you're photographing through the fence in a zoo and the camera focuses on the fence instead of the animal, you can use manual focus. Don't confuse manual focus with manual exposure though. Few photographers use manual focus regularly, but many use manual exposure. If you're now eager to dive deeper and create images like this and that, I have a complete course for you that will teach you everything you need to know about photography in 11 days. It goes much further and even includes lessons on composition and finding the best light. Check out the link in the description. See you there.